Steven, you've been covering death row for years. You ever seen anything like this happen?
No, not at all.
Hey guys, Steve Cavendish here. I am talking with reporter Steven Hale. Today was the scheduled execution date for Tony Carruthers, but things did not go according to plan. The execution happens in a small chamber with a couple of different rooms off to the side. You're on one end, and then the witnesses are on another end. What happens when you go in that room?
Yeah, so like you say, there's the execution chamber, and then there's two kind of viewing rooms, I guess
kind
you'd
of
call
perpendicular
them.
to each other.
Right. The media witness viewing room has reporters in it, TDOC officials. The person who's being executed, their attorney will be in there with the reporters, someone from the AG's office, and then sometimes someone from the person who's being executed, their family, if they're there.
What's it like sitting in the dark in there?
It's strange. I mean, and that this will get us into kind of what went awry today, but it's a strange. I don't entirely know why they have the lights off, for one thing, but yeah, they bring you in the viewing room and sit you down, and then they turn all the lights off. I imagine the lights are turned off during an execution because then you can just see into the lit execution chamber, but the person in the execution chamber can't necessarily see into your room. But when you walk in there, the curtain's closed, and so you're just in this small black, dark room. And it is very strange and kind of disorienting because you also don't know. It's hard to know what time it is and how long you've been there. In this case, I was sitting next to, there's this phone on the wall that the prison officials can use to call out different places if they need to, and that has a screen with a little clock on it. So I was actually able to see what time it was, but it is strange. I mean, and in the past, in my experience, we've sat in there, I don't know, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe at max before they open the curtains and start the execution. And as we've indicated, that didn't happen today.
No. So how long passed when you were sitting there? Did you start to think, or did you start to hear something and made you think, this is not the scheduled?
Right. Well, actually, but before we even got in there, because the execution was scheduled to be done at 10 o'clock. We weren't taken into the viewing room until almost 10:30, like 10:29. So even by then, we were like, seems like there's a delay, but the Department of Corrections staff who were with us, specifically Dorinda Carter, who's their head communications director, she at one point told us, okay, we're going to stay here in this room for a little longer because apparently there's some movement in the courts. But again, to your point earlier, we don't have our phones, so we were in an information blackout, really. After the fact, it seems that maybe, and this is what Tony Carruthers' attorney told us after the fact, but that the Supreme Court had not yet denied the ACLU's motion for a stay or request for a stay.
This was the emergency petition that the ACLU had brought up on the day before the execution.
Yes, as we're talking yesterday, Wednesday.
And so because of the district that we're in, this falls under Brett Kavanaugh's purview, unless, the entire court wants to take it up. And I was on the outside. I was back here at Banner HQ, and I saw the Kavanaugh thing pop up, and it's usually like a one sentence sort of statement sort of thing. And I thought, okay, well, that was it.
Yeah, that normally that would clear the way for it. That would be the last thing. And what we found out after the fact was that the prison officials had held up because the Supreme Court hadn't ruled yet, and there's some question and as to there was some question as to, well, will they execute him before the Supreme Court has denied? But apparently they decided not to do that, so they waited for that. But we didn't know that at the time, so we were like, we thought maybe the governor's done something, maybe the court has granted a stay. We had no idea, and the people we were with didn't know either because they were just with us. But getting back to your question, like so we knew something was delaying it. We didn't know what. And then we're sitting there for quite a while without anything much happening. Not for a little bit. For quite a while, we were just sitting there silently, thinking there was a delay, but not really even knowing what it might be. And then it was, let's see, I'm actually checking my notebook here. This is kind of interesting. Around 11:03, just after 11, so we've been there a little more than 30 minutes. During Carter, who I mentioned, who's the communications director, she told one of the other TDOC staffers, I need to step out a minute. And so we're all like on high alert at this point, just because we're thinking like, maybe, why isn't this happening yet? You know? And she went out, she came back. And then at 11:13 is the first note I have about being able to hear discussion that I could make out. We could tell there were people in the execution chamber. We could hear movement and sort of muffled voices, but we didn't know what they were saying. I heard a man's voice saying, to the best of my knowledge, saying something like, Mr. Carruthers, this is the lidocaine, which I also thought I was mishearing because that didn't make any sense to me.
That is, if you say lidocaine, probably
not part of the lethal injection protocol.
Set off your spidey senses.
So the point being, we started hearing some discussion. We could hear Mr. Carruthers' attorney, Maria Deliberato from the ACLU, who was in there with him, say to one of the men who was in the room, who was the doctor contracted by the state to be a part of this, questioning his qualifications to be doing what he was doing. We heard him kind of snap back, I'm qualified. And then another man, who we later learned was the person from the Attorney General's office, say, do your job, sir. And Maria Deliberato was kind of assuring him throughout this. She kept saying, you know, I'm here, Tony, it's okay. Or if she left the room, she'd say, I'll be back in 5 minutes, Tony, because she was, again, we didn't learn this until later, but she was in touch with some of his other attorneys.
So what you couldn't see on the inside was that they were making an emergency appeal to the state Supreme Court. It's doesn't look like a regular filing. It's essentially a numbered list. It's like 7 things that are going wrong kind of in this procedure, not the least of which is they say the doctor that was contracted by TDOC to put in the IV line, and then the procedure is if you can't get in an IV line and a backup line, you have to put in a central line, that he was not competent to put in the central line.
Right. In hindsight, I don't know why it didn't occur to me that they were having trouble with the IVs. We kind of heard that back and forth. Things went silent again.
Again, you're still in the dark.
We're still sitting in the dark room. We heard at one point what we thought was Tony Carruthers groaning, sounding like he was kind of groaning in pain. We sit there a little longer, and by this point, we've been in there in the dark room for over an hour when we heard someone came in and told Tony Carruthers, we're going to kind of get you up. And they said, we're going to bring you back to your cell. So then we obviously knew it wasn't going to happen right then, but we still didn't know why this was happening. So they took us out of the viewing room at 11:48, and they didn't start walking us out of the prison until 12:25. So that's another, 30 minutes or something that we were sitting there. And we still thought, well, maybe the execution is still going to happen today. And the funny thing is, Dorinda Carter, the TDOC spokesperson, she had her phone. At one point, she just pulled up Google. Like, she just looked online and she saw a commercial appeal story, I think, that was about the emergency court filing that you referenced. So that's when we found out about the IVs, that, okay, they had trouble placing the IVs and his lawyers had filed in court asking for a stay and all this. But again, even then, we're like, well, did the stay get approved? Did they just stop and then they're going to bring us back in there and do it? Like, we were still very unsure of what was going to happen.
Meanwhile, the court has now ruled, because the court has gotten word from Governor Lee's office that there is a 1-year reprieve for Carruthers, but there's not any other detail besides that. And so the court issues a ruling denying the motion to stop everything because they say it's moot.
Because it's moot, because now there's a reprieve. So they finally bring us back out there, bring us back outside, and what typically happens is after the execution, it's a pool, right? It's a media pool. So right. A smaller group of reporters is inside, witnesses the execution, comes out and does essentially a press conference and tells all the rest of the media that's there what they saw, takes questions. Normally, maybe victim's family would give a statement if they want to. The commissioner of the Department of Correction would give a statement. Well, this time no execution had happened. As we're walking out, the department officials gave us a printed out, clearly like it had just been typed up and printed out statement, which they since released, that it said very, very a terse statement, that said basically the medical team placed a primary IV, but then followed the protocol and tried to place a second one. That was unsuccessful. They tried to place a central line. That was unsuccessful. The execution was called off. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was pretty just, that's what happened. So that's all we knew. We walked out, did essentially the same thing we would have done, which is kind of give a press conference of what we had heard and seen, what had happened to our knowledge.
Your hour and a half in the dark.
Right. When we really found more out was after that press conference. I'm glad she messaged me, because I actually was walking to my car when we learned that Maria Deliberato was outside and was ready to speak to the media. So a group of us went over to a different tent and sat down and talked to her and heard her experience, what she witnessed from sort of the other side of the curtain that we could only hear but didn't see. The first thing she said they tortured him. They tortured him trying to find a vein. She said they initially placed the IV line in his right arm. She said it took them a few tries to get that one, but that they did get it in. The lethal injection protocol says that they have to put in a second one as kind of a backup. And so then they went to his left arm to try to do that. And it sounds like that's when things really started going badly. They kept trying, so they're sticking him with a needle over and over again and not successfully getting a vein. From there, she said they tried to get a vein in his hand. They tried to get a vein in his feet.
Ugh.
They were going to move then to try the central line in the sort of chest area, but she said then the doctor in there stopped and asked if anyone knew how to basically do a line through the jugular vein. So they tried that, or started to go for that kind of in the neck, and couldn't get that either. By then, unbeknownst to us at the time inside, by then they had already been trying to get a IV line in him for, close to an hour.
And the central line should kind of set up some flares for anybody who's kind of followed the death penalty over the last 10 years or so. One of the most famous sort of botched executions was this case in Oklahoma, mm-hmm. where they had to go to a central line, and when they did, the line kind of came like halfway out, and
it was Clayton Lockett, right?
Yeah, it was a horrific sort of
it went on for a very long time. And maybe this is a good place to note that the other thing that was hanging over this is, and we published a story about this a couple days ago, was that in the run-up to this execution, starting more than a month ago, lawyers at the Federal Public Defender's Office who were representing Tony Carruthers started asking the state and the prison officials to confirm that their drug, pentobarbital, that they were going to use in this lethal injection was not expired.
And the problem for folks, if that drug is expired, and most of these things are compounded drugs.
Right. So it's, I guess, it may be more correct to say if the chemicals used to make the drug are expired. But the reason that's an issue, which is a good question, is that the drug may be less potent. So if they give him the same dose, but it's less potent, it may still kill him, but it just may be a prolonged, very painful process. Basically, it's just another thing that could go wrong if they're using bad drugs. There are a lot of other medical, problems that can arise from using expired drugs in this way. So that was hanging over all this too, while this is going on. And to your point, the central line itself, to even get that far, meant that things were not going well. What Maria Deliberato told us was that after they couldn't get the central line in, they actually tried one more time on his right side in his shoulder. She said they got that in. They kind of maybe at first thought it was successful, but she said that there was blood coming down the line out of him. So which is not a good sign for people who, I'm not a medical professional, but that's not what they were wanting to see. So it was going disastrously. And she said that at this point, he was in agony, is the word she used. We could hear him groaning in pain. It sounded like in pain, and she said he was in pain. And then the warden got a phone call and told her it's off, and how that chain of command happened, I don't exactly know, but you've already described the stuff that was happening in the courts. The governor granted a reprieve, and so they called off the execution.
Can I just ask something that I think a lot of people who are listening this far might be wondering, and you've written a book on this. Why do we go watch these things?
I feel strongly, and I think we agree about this, and I think this is a broadly shared media view. It's why we're all part of that lawsuit about the transparency in the death penalty, is that if the state is going to execute people, its own citizens, that it can't do it in secret. It can't do it in a room by itself, that they have to let people watch it. And my specific reason for volunteering to do it the times I have is that I can sometimes get on a soapbox and start saying things I think are right and true. And I felt like if I'm going to have that strong feeling that they need to let people witness executions, if they're going to, then I should be willing to be one of the people who does it. I don't want to do every one, but it takes a lot of people to do it. A lot of other reporters that we know have done this, and there were other reporters out there today. But yeah, so that's why. I think people need to at least be able to hear firsthand accounts of what it is like when the state executes someone.
What's next?
Partly, we don't know, in the sense that now there's been a 1-year reprieve, which is basically just like a pause. Okay, well, your execution date now is punted back a year. But a lot of the legal issues with the case are still there. Some of those have been settled in the sense that they have taken them all the way up to the Supreme Court. For instance, one of the issues in this case was Tony Carruthers' mental health.
Right. And
his attorneys earlier this year went to court arguing that he was mentally incompetent to be executed, that they described it as he had psychotic delusions about his case. They said that he was convinced he was not going to be executed because he was going to be released soon because his innocence, which he's also always maintained, was about to be revealed. Like, it was just so, a judge rejected that, and they appealed that all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected that. That, I don't know where else they go with that argument now, because they've litigated it in that way. Maybe there are different ways that will come up again, but the big one is he and his attorneys still maintain that he is innocent.
And there's some DNA.
Yes, and so there is some crime scene evidence that was never tested that the ACLU has been fighting in court to have DNA and fingerprint analysis done on it. And they say that it could prove his innocence. Carruthers was convicted in 1996 for a triple murder that took place 2 years before in 1994
and what was, and I didn't realize this until this week, the first televised trial in Tennessee.
I didn't know that either, actually.
Thank you, DK, for
that. That is interesting. Yeah, so it's a Shelby County, Memphis case. 3 people were killed: Marcellus Anderson, his mother, Delois Anderson, and his teenage friend, Frederick Tucker. And these 3 victims were found buried in a North Memphis cemetery. So 3 people were arrested for these murders: Tony Carruthers, James Montgomery, and Jonathan Montgomery. Jonathan Montgomery killed himself in jail before the trial could happen. But James Montgomery and Tony Carruthers were eventually convicted and sentenced to death. Talking about this case is difficult because basically every kind of big issue that comes up in death penalty cases is present in this case. And so you have to touch a lot of bases. One of the extraordinary things about this case, and so we're not trying people's patience, just say I'm saying all this because this is all relevant to what happens now, because these questions are still out there, right? Tony Carruthers actually ended up representing himself in this capital murder trial
because he went through 6 attorneys.
He went through 6 defense attorneys. why did that happen? Well, it depends. I mean, I wasn't there, but his attorneys have talked about how, one, they said, he had mental illness at the time. He was a difficult client to deal with, to put it mildly. But also he was then insisting on his innocence. And so that there was tension. I've had people tell me, his sister talked about this to me, that he didn't want to take a plea deal. He said he wasn't going to plead guilty to something that he insisted he was innocent of. And so that caused conflict with his attorneys. In any case, 6 defense attorneys beg off this case, and the judge refused to appoint a 7th one. Apparently frustrated at the perception that he was just trying to delay the trial or whatever, and saying, okay, if you won't work with any of these other attorneys, you're going to represent yourself. So he represented himself in this trial, and by all accounts, he was very bad at it. And he ended up, the state's case, there was no physical evidence presented at the trial that tied him to the murders. There was the testimony of a paid informant who later recanted that testimony, but Tony Carruthers called that man to testify as one of his witnesses in the trial, thinking that because that man had recanted his accusations, he said, this informant, his name's Alfredo Shaw, he said that Carruthers had confessed to him. It's a sort of jailhouse confession story. He then gave interviews saying that that wasn't true. Then he went to the trial, and the state didn't call him, but Tony Carruthers called him in his own defense, presumably thinking this guy is going to come on the stand and say that story I told was fake. But under the threat of perjury, he just repeated the story about Carruthers confessing. So the conviction relies heavily on a paid informant whose story, is highly questionable, at least. And then another thing we wrote about at the banner, his death sentence rested largely on the idea that the 3 victims were buried alive. A medical examiner who was called by the state at the trial said that, in his opinion, the victims were buried alive. And that medical examiner was O.C. Smith. People listening to this should Google that name. He was quite a character. He would later lose his career basically in disgrace in a case where he claimed he had been attacked and that someone had strapped a bomb to him and wrapped his head in barbed wire or something. All kinds of crazy stuff. Turned out he faked this, did it to himself. So his career ended in disgrace, but at this point, he was still a medical examiner, gave this opinion that the victims were buried alive. There was another forensic expert who, it turns out, had also been contacted about the case and asked by the court to give an opinion. He was ready to testify that was not true, that there was no evidence that the victims had been buried alive, but he was not called to testify, quite possibly because Tony Carruthers was representing himself and is not a trained lawyer and did not recognize that might save his life. But the prosecution really leaned on the idea that the victims were buried alive when they were asking for the death penalty, because that's the detail that they said made this, especially heinous crime. In the years since, O.C. Smith, the original medical examiner, has signed an affidavit saying he no longer could stand by the opinion that they were buried alive, and 2 other forensic experts said that there was no evidence they were buried alive. So to put all that in a shorter way, you have we're told, mentally ill man who represents himself at a trial where the prosecutors rely on the testimony of a paid informant and the since recanted and refuted opinion of a medical examiner to convict him and sentence him to death.
Not optimal.
And so now, so again, I can't say where, sitting here right now, I'm not sure where all that will stand legally, because I don't know, and when it comes to appealing your death penalty case, there are certain levels of appeals, and you can exhaust all those. And it may be that Tony Carruthers has done that. But as a reporter and just as a person, those questions are still out there to me. So I'm interested to see what is done with those. I don't know if and how the ACLU will be able to try to pursue DNA testing, even though their legal motions to that effect have been unsuccessful so far. But now they have a year. I don't know what kind of stuff they'll be able to do to try to get that DNA testing done. So maybe something happens on that front. But yeah, it will be interesting to see. But the only thing we know for sure is that Tony Carruthers is not going to get executed for the next year.
Steven, thank you. Appreciate you doing this work. If you want to read the whole story, you can find that and all of our previous coverage at NashvilleBanner.com.